Space looked like a graveyard tonight. Across the void, a vast black stage was lit by the dying fires of ruined engines and the cold, indifferent pinpricks of distant stars. Wounded ships limped along their trajectories, leaving shredded trails of plasma and metal behind them. In the middle of this chaos, a small, human-made relay station drifted. Its hull was scarred with scorch marks, and its lights flickered like a tired, fading heartbeat. But its cameras saw everything. They captured the long-range volleys that stitched the darkness with brilliant white lines. They watched explosions bloom like pale, silent flowers before collapsing into nothing. Two alien fleets were locked in a deadly dance. One side moved in precise, gliding formations, their sleek hulls marked with glowing glyphs. The other fought in jagged, unpredictable swarms, their ships darting and disappearing like blades in the night. And caught between them, at the very heart of the violence, lay a jump gate, a dull, ancient ring of stone and humming conduits, a lifeline for refugees and traders. Huddled around that gate was a cluster of transports and shuttles. Most were already dead in the water, drifting aimlessly. Some were still burning. Through the relay's open microphone, a voice bled through the static. It wasn't the hard, formal tone of a military channel. It was ragged, choked with fear. The relay software tried to match the speech to its language database, but it failed. The audio was fed to a separate window where volunteers across human systems watched, frantically typing, trying to help. Suddenly, one command was translated, a single shape of meaning emerging from the noise. "Do not fire." The phrase blinked on the human fleet's shared chat, a stark warning flare. On board the human colony vessel, the Soteria, Commander Mira Kato stood before a wall of live feeds, her face bathed in their light. Her crew moved with a quiet, practiced urgency. The chat overlay on her screen scrolled faster than anyone could read, a flood of messages from civilians, militia volunteers, and old veterans, all calling out tactics and identifying ships. The relay's cameras zoomed in on a small group of people clustered inside one of the transports. Their faces were pressed against a window, their eyes hollow from too much running, too much fear. Mira didn't need every word translated. She saw the gate's location. She saw the scrap heap of broken ships. And she saw how both alien fleets ignored the civilians as they fought for a tactical advantage. She could feel just how small that cluster of refugees was in the cold, hard calculus of war. She had spent her entire life in systems where choices were made to save economies, not people. But tonight, that rule felt like rust in her mouth. "How many aboard the gate?" she asked, her voice low. "Hard to say," replied Leon at his console, his fingers a blur across the keys. "Looks like 24 large transports, maybe 300 people packed into shuttles, plus debris. If they try to jump with damaged drives, they'll tear themselves apart." Mira's mouth tightened into a thin line. The Soteria was not a warship. Its hull was adorned with carved murals of old Earth constellations. Its armory was modest old kinetic slugs, a handful of pulse drones, and fighters that had seen more asteroid storms than actual battles. But it carried people. People who couldn't just stand by and watch others die. Outside, in the chaos of the public chat, someone typed a simple, powerful phrase: "Humanity does not watch." The words hit Mira with the force of a prayer. "Prepare for jump," she said, her voice steady and calm. For a moment, the crew hesitated. Jumping into a live battle without authorization from the fleet was a career-ending move, at best. At worst, it meant becoming a target for everyone. Every protocol screamed against it. Leon looked up at her, a silent question in his eyes. Mira met his gaze without flinching. "Authorize it," she commanded. No one argued. Across the vacuum, the two alien armadas continued to carve their violent stories into the fabric of space. The Calanth, with their long, silvery frames, fired beams that melted armor into glowing lattice. The Turs moved faster, their hulls covered in shifting plates that deflected sensor sweeps. Between them, shrapnel and small craft tumbled like autumn leaves in a storm. The relay's feed showed children's toys floating in microgravity. A family picture stuck to a bulkhead with a magnet. The Soteria's engines folded space and leapt. The jump was a clean, sharp slash through the deep dark. When they emerged, the view punched them like a blast of cold wind. The battle was right on top of them. Heat signatures painted the main screen in angry shades of orange. The human fighters, 8 of them in total, flown by pilots with steady hands and calm eyes, pulled into a tight, unusual formation. They didn't take up long-range positions. Instead, they angled low, weaving through the debris field, making it clear they were willing to risk their own hulls to save lives. On the relay feed, Someone began to livestream the Soteria's dramatic rival. The public chat exploded. Voices in dozens of languages shouted, swore, and prayed. Songs were posted, anthems of hope and defiance. On board the Soteria, a young pilot named Jace, known for his ripple of white hair and a grin that never quite reached his eyes, watched his fighter become a tiny fragile line against the massive armored plates of the alien warships. "Keep your eyes on the gate," Mira's voice came over the comms, a line of steel. "Protect the transports. We do not engage unless they fire on the gate." The first moment of pure terror came swiftly. A TERS missile sliced free from a darting carrier and shot through the vacuum like a predator. It locked onto one of the defenseless transports. For a single heartbeat, everything seemed to slow down. Jace's hand tightened on his controls. He pushed his craft faster. An impossible slip-hand slide between burning fragments of ships. He rammed the missile's guidance field with a tiny kinetic drone. The missile veered off course, clipping a derelict hull and exploding harmlessly. The transport shuddered but survived. A cheer swept through the Soteria's bridge, but it was small and quickly swallowed by the tension. The alien commanders, noticing this new player on the field, turned their attention. You could almost feel their irritation, like gods who had just found a bothersome pest in their garden. Their formations wavered, then pivoted. The entire center of the battle began to shift, moving towards the small human fleet. The relay's camera recorded the exact second both armadas reoriented their primary weapons. Mira felt the immense weight of that moment settle on her shoulders. She had made a choice that could get them all killed, or burn her people's name into history as heroes. Behind her, the chat filled with a new wave of messages. "Why are you doing this? They are not our people. We are watching." The Soteria's shields flickered as a beam of energy sang past, close enough to burn a groove through empty space. The human fleet braced for impact. In their fragile transports near the gate, the refugees hunched down, watching the new lights in the sky, unsure if they represented salvation or just another form of doom. The final shot from the relay focused on a single, powerful image. Its camera caught a child's small hand pressed against a scratched viewport, fingers spread wide like a map to a world they might never reach. Outside, alien gunfire painted fiery arcs directly toward that tiny hand. Inside the Soteria, Commander Mira Kato took a deep breath. The deck beneath her feet hummed with a new, terrible, and unwavering resolve. The moment the alien fleets shifted their focus, the small human group aboard the Soteria braced as one. Their fighters fanned out in a pattern that looked almost suicidal to anyone trained in traditional long-range combat. They weren't looking for a slugfest. They were getting close, surgical. Their mission was to cut at specific points weapon mounts, sensor rays, the delicate hinges that allowed missiles to find their targets. The humans moved like repairmen caught in a raging storm. Quick hands, steady eyes, and a baffling willingness to get close enough to touch a burning engine. From the bridge of the Soteria, Mira watched the feeds, her focus razor sharp. Her orders were simple and direct. Shield the gate, get the civilians to the relay pods, and do not engage unless the gate itself is threatened. This wasn't a rule born of mercy. It was pure calculation. A single destroyed jump gate could strand hundreds of refugees for months. Stranded refugees die, whether from the cold void, starvation, or the slow, grinding attrition of war. The Soteria had no authority to wage a war, but it had every right, every duty, to keep that gate alive. The first to strike were the Callanth. Their energy beams carved the darkness with slow, deliberate arcs. Their ships moved like words in a formal speech, measured, precise, and confident. The Callanth commander broadcast a long, sonorous message, a diplomatic demand that shredded the Soteria's translation software. The tone was formal, but the threat was crystal clear. Withdraw or be labeled an aggressor. The TERS answered not with words, but with violence. A swarm of cloaked missiles and kamikaze drones erupted from the shadows. Their ships moved in jagged, tooth-like patterns, striking hard and then pulling away. The TERS weren't interested in diplomacy. They wanted to break the human flank before the Callanth could even marshal a proper response. The first human fighter to fall was a small, patched-up vessel flown by Ren, the squad leader. His craft took a critical hit near the engines and began to spin out of control. But even as his ship died, Ren managed to launch an electronic flare that momentarily blinded a cluster of TERS drones. That single act of sacrifice bought just enough time for two transport ships to pull free from the chaos. The human fighters were taking casualties. Metal screamed and fuel boiled in the void. But for every loss, they exploited a gap the aliens had left open. Human tactics were maddeningly difficult to read. They didn't try to outgun the Calanth. Instead, they targeted the projectors for their powerful beams, launching tiny drones that clung to the warships and chewed through their cooling vents. Against the Ter's missile swarms, they deployed chaff and mimic signatures, making the deadly projectiles chase ghosts. The alien fleets reacted with visible irritation, their once perfect formations losing their confident geometry. The presence of these strange, unpredictable humans had become a disruptive new variable in their ancient war. From the Soteria, Mira ordered the launch of the rescue pods. These were small, fragile capsules, each designed to hold just 20 people. They were slow, vulnerable, and rode the absolute edge of danger, zipping out to scoop refugees from the wreckage of destroyed transports and ferrying them back to the relative safety of the relay station. The station's camera feeds showed the desperation hands reaching out, grip slipping, a small figure tumbling through a hatch just a second before a ruptured fuel line ignited behind them. Each successful rescue felt like a small, precious miracle, but not all miracles held. A TERS missile found one of the pods. The feed showed it tear the small craft into a silent, blossoming flower of debris. The screen froze for a long, helpless second before blinking back to the frantic motion of the battle. There was no time to mourn. The humans had to keep pushing. To stop, to lose, would mean nothing but bodies and broken promises. Amid the chaos, a translator algorithm on the Soteria finally wrestled the alien broadcasts into a form humans could understand. The messages were chillingly similar. The Calanth demanded the humans leave, promising safe passage for the refugees only if the gate was ceded to them. The TERS were more direct. They threatened to destroy the gate entirely, just to deny the Calanth any strategic advantage. Both sides treated the refugees as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. They saw assets and liabilities, not faces. Mira's hands hovered over the command console. She decided to try diplomacy first. Opening a direct channel, she broadcast in a blunt, unmistakably human tone. She didn't send threats or counter demands. She sent images of the refugees, names, medical data, even children's drawings they'd scrawled. "We will escort them," she said into the crackling static. "We are neutral. Let them go." Her message was met with a moment of silence, then a burst of what sounded like grinding glass from the TERS channel. A laugh. The Calanth replied with a long, bureaucratic list of demands, witnesses, guarantees, and the appointment of a neutral arbiter. They wanted forms filled out and seals stamped while a battle raged around them. War had turned them into cosmic bureaucrats. But that small, human attempt at reason did something unexpected. It confused the alien commanders. Their war had established rules, contracts of honor that had been followed for centuries. To see a new species step onto the battlefield and offer humanitarian terms, rather than trying to seize a prize for themselves, completely broke the script. For a few precious minutes, the battle lines wavered. Each fleet reined in its advance, looking to the other for a cue. The human fighters seized that pause. They used the moment to plant jammers on key Calanth sensor towers. The devices were crude, almost as old as the Soteria itself, but at close range, they could blind a beam array for a few crucial seconds. A pilot named Jace, known for his habit of smiling under pressure, flew one of the jamming drones on a tight, dangerous run along a Calanth warship's hull. His hands flew across his controls, his breath shallow. He managed to wedge the jammer into a critical rail and eject into the blackness of space. The jammer pulsed, and for a heartbeat, a whole sector of the Calanth's main weapons failed to lock on. But the pause couldn't last. The TERS uncovered a hidden firing solution and lit up the void. The Calanth, recovering from the jam, unleashed a massive defensive volley. The human fighters folded back into a living wall, taking blows and giving what they could in return. The Soteria's shields shuddered under hits that weren't meant to break them, but to test their limits. Then, a new message came from the Calanth flagship, its translation sharp and clear. The commander, an elder with ceremonial bone adorning one eye, broadcast a single sentence: "Interferers will be treated as combatants." The declaration was a blade. Being officially labeled a combatant meant that every treaty of war could be invoked against them. Their small, desperate rescue operation could now trigger a much broader conflict. The relay's comms channel filled with a new kind of panic warnings, pleas, and a single, stark countdown. 5 hours until the Conclave arrived. The Conclave. The word alone sent a chill through the Soteria. An ancient, almost mythical power that policed interfleet law with fleets that acted like forces of nature. Mira had only heard rumors of their existence, vast, impartial, and utterly unforgiving. To be named an aggressor before their rival was like being condemned before a trial. The alien commanders paused again, this time for a sharper reason. If the Conclave judged the humans to be aggressors, there would be no safe harbor for them anywhere. Mira faced a stark choice. She could retreat and save her crew, leaving the refugees to their fate, and likely avoid the Conclave's wrath. Or she could stand her ground, try to shepherd those last few lives to safety, and gamble everything against two alien fleets and the judgment of the galaxy's ultimate authority. Her decision came like a low flame, steady and unwavering. "We keep the gate," she said, her voice clear across the bridge. "We move the refugees. We do not let them be pawns." Around her, the crew moved as if she'd lit a match in a dark room. The rescue pods kept flying. The human fighters kept cutting at the weapons, at the sensors, at the very things that made the alien war machines precise. Each small victory was like threading a needle in a hurricane. And in doing so, the humans revealed something profound to the two seasoned alien fleets. They weren't interested in conquest. They weren't fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for life. That simple, dangerous difference changed the very shape of the battle. The Gallant and the Turs didn't know how to deal with such an enemy, because in all their long histories of war, they had never written the rules for an opponent who wouldn't take a prize, but would risk everything just to save a child. The Soteria hung suspended, a tiny, defiant moon caught between the gravitational pull of two mighty empires. Around it, the battlefield pulsed with a life of its own, thinning and thickening like the breath of some colossal beast. Refugee pods, dozens of them, clustered near the relay station, drawn to it like moths to a flickering lamp. From her command chair, Mira watched the faces flicker across her screens. An old man, his jaw marked by a deep, ancient scar. A nurse, humming a quiet tune to a restless child cradled in her arms. A teenage boy, his knuckles bone-white as he gripped a worn-out stuffed animal. She felt the immense weight of those faces settle in her chest. They weren't just data points on a strategic map. They were lives, each one a universe of breath and memory. Mira decided to try diplomacy one last time. But this time, she wouldn't send just words. She opened the channels and poured out a flood of proof. Medical scans showing injuries consistent with their stories. Registry logs from their lost homes. A smudged, heartbreaking photograph of a town now buried beneath a sea of glassed stone. Her crew worked with the frantic energy of both archivists and master illusionists, pulling together scattered records from battered hard drives, and the fragmented memories of the survivors themselves. Her second-in-command, Leon, pieced together a collapsed star chart that perfectly matched the refugees' harrowing tale. A planet, once vibrant, now scorched and lifeless, burned months ago. The survivors had been pushed outwards by relentless waves of automated glassing drones. The human feed streamed this evidence in a slow, steady, undeniable flow, hoping that the raw power of images could slice through the thick armor of suspicion. The Gallant commander, a being of rigid protocol, watched the proofs and demanded witnesses. Their ancient code required sworn oaths from neutral arbiters and physical attestations. Meanwhile, the Turs, more aggressive and direct, wanted the gate destroyed outright. For them, it was simple. Better to deny their enemy a potential prize than to risk being deceived. Both empires sent envoys. They arrived in transparent pods, sealed biological auditors floating silently between the massive warships. Their very tissues were braided with ceremonial ink and metallic sigils, living embodiments of their laws. Upon arrival, both alien delegations made the same demand: to inspect the refugees personally. The Gallant wanted to sample their DNA, to cross-check every last individual against their exhaustive databases. The Turs wanted to see their faces, to look into their eyes before they would even consider allowing passage. The human crew knew exactly what these inspections meant. The refugees, already stripped of their homes and dignity, would be paraded like evidence in a courtroom. Rescue would become a cold, clinical interrogation. They might even be seized, used as forced labor or as bargaining chips in the larger conflict. Mira had no intention of letting that happen. She countered with a bold offer. The humans would hand over complete authority of the gate to a neutral escort, but only if both fleets guaranteed safe passage for every single refugee and withdrew their weapons. Until the convoy was clear of the system, the Gallant replied with a long, dense list of legal stipulations and clauses. The Turs answered with a curt, hostile refusal. The silence that followed tasted like iron. Time itself seemed to thin, stretching and growing brittle. The arrival of the Conclave, the galaxy's ultimate arbiters, ticked closer with every passing second. The alien commanders wore their ancient patience like armor, but beneath that stoic exterior, their minds churned with cold calculation. If the Conclave judged humanity to be an aggressor, all bargaining would cease. If not, the humans might have just carved out a new sphere of power for themselves. Both sides wanted leverage, and they were willing to wait. So Mira set a different kind of trap. She ordered a single ship, an unarmed, patched-up ferry named the Kindred, to fly directly into the space between the two alien flagships. The Kindred carried no weapons, only the faces of the refugees and a live, unedited feed broadcast on every open frequency. Children crying, a grandmother's name being whispered like a prayer, the recipe for a simple stew, scribbled on a napkin. The feed had no propaganda, no clever edits, just people, living out the small, profound truths of survival. The Turs hissed into their communication nets, their fury tangled with a strange disquiet. For a few heartbeats, the battlefield transformed into a courtroom, where the accused stood with no defense but their own breath. The human gambit exploited something ancient, something deep within the galactic psyche. The sight of the small and the defenseless can slow the hand of even the most prepared killer. Still, the armadas held their ground, their weapons primed. The Calanth demanded notarized seals and formal witnesses. The Turs whispered of hidden traps and sabotage. Neither side would fully back down. The Kindred's broadcast bought them time, maybe 10 minutes, 15 at most, but it couldn't last forever. While the alien commanders haggled, the human crew moved like a colony of ants, loading refugees into convoys, recalibrating jump windows, working against the clock. In those frantic, stolen minutes, Leon was working on another plan entirely. He had discovered an old, obscure exploit in the Conclave's ceremonial codes, protocol markings used to certify official arbitration fleets. If they could spoof those codes just for a little while, they could make their convoy appear as a verified, neutral party. The alien fleets might then be forced, by their own rigid rules, to allow them passage. The idea was monumentally risky. The Conclave's codes were sacred. Faking them would be an act of profound deception, an insult that could bring the wrath of the galaxy's highest authority down upon them. But the alternative was a massacre. Mira weighed the cost. To fake the Conclave's marks was a breach of trust that could anger the unseen arbiters for generations. To refuse was to condemn hundreds of people to death, right here, right now. Her hand closed into a fist, a decision that tasted of rust and salt. "Do it," she ordered. Leon's fingers flew across the console of the old relay's core. He fed the forged seals into the broadcast, tuning the relay's very voice to mimic the sonic signature of Conclave prayer radios. He layered old arbitration tones over the human channel and wove the refugee manifests into the data stream. With the solemn cadence of a legal recitation, the net began to sing like a cathedral bell. The Calanth systems immediately flagged the signature and paused. The Turs hesitated, their deep-seated distrust tangled with their respect for protocol. For a fleeting moment, the two fleets balked. The forged Conclave chorus was imperfect. Both alien commanders could feel its jagged edges, like a blade hidden under silk. They could demand a physical Conclave envoy for verification. They could run their own scans and expose the lie. But each had their own reasons to accept the token. Political maneuvering, saving face, the fear of being the first to openly break protocol. The tense negotiations stretched on. The human convoys began to crawl toward a narrow corridor of safe space, their engines running low, their profiles minimized. Each meter gained required precise timing and a level of trust that simply didn't exist. A single misfire, a single nervous trigger finger, could turn that corridor into a coffin. As the convoys inched forward, the Conclave's own scouts appeared on long-range sensors, pale, immense artifacts of enforcement, hanging motionless in the distant dark. Their sudden presence hardened the alien commanders' faces. The forged signals might buy them a corridor, but the main Conclave body would demand absolute proof. The hourglass was draining faster now. Mira looked at the faces on her bridge, the fear, the stubbornness, the resigned courage. Around her, the crew recited names into the calms, as if speaking them aloud could keep fate at bay. On the relay's live feed, a small boy whispered a joke into a radio, trying to make the woman beside him laugh. Those tiny, fragile moments were what the Soteria was gambling everything on. The standoff compressed into a single, desperate question. Could humanity trick the laws of an entire galaxy long enough to save a few hundred lives? It wasn't a noble plan. It was a desperate, dirty stitch in the fabric of a torn universe. But for Mira and her crew, there was no higher law than the two small hands that clung to the Kindred's bulkhead. The clock continued its slow, indifferent roll toward the Conclave's rival. The fragile convoy moved, engines whispering, and the human ships closed ranks, their hulls forming a hedge against the cold, unfeeling logic of war. The rest of the galaxy watched, and somewhere, beyond the smoke and the chaos, another judgment drew near. The corridor ahead was a razor of dark, wedged between two gravity wells. It was the only way out, the only clear path that wasn't choked with mines and wreckage from long-forgotten battles. Our convoys, small and fragile, were lining up to thread this needle. Behind us, the Calanth and the Turs fleets were watching, waiting for us to make a single mistake, and far beyond them, hanging like pale, silent monuments in the dark, were the Conclave scouts. They were patient, inevitable. The entire system felt like it was compressing into mere minutes. We had bought ourselves a window of time, a sliver of hope, using forged Conclave signatures, a lie broadcast across the stars. But it was only a temporary pass. The main Conclave fleet would still demand a visual confirmation once they arrived in orbit. If they scanned us and found the marks were fake, their judgment would be absolute. The Soteria, my ship, had to make them hesitate. We had to give the refugees enough time to escape. It was a gamble, with every single life on the table. Inside the Soteria, my crew moved like a single, anxious engine. Leon was hunched over his console, sweating in the blue glow of code, maintaining the deception. Jace and the other pilots were out there in the void, running tight, dangerous patterns, drawing enemy fire away from the vulnerable convoys. Our engineers were reconfiguring the shields, forming them into narrow protective cones to shelter the refugee ships. Medics were prepping their kits, triaging the wounded from the last skirmish. Every action, every breath, was measured against the relentless ticking of a clock. Then, a voice crackled over a private comms channel. 5 hours. Someone had been tracking the Conclave's jump timings. It was an ominous prediction that settled over the bridge like a layer of dust. The pause we had bought with our lies could evaporate at any moment. We couldn't hold them off forever. I ordered a new layer to the plan. Deception followed by theater. If the Conclave demanded proof, we would give them something impossible to ignore. Not just forged codes, but our lives laid bare. Leon would keep the spoof running just long enough to get the last convoy into the corridor. Then, we would drop all shields and broadcast everything. Continuous, live, unfiltered streams of refugee faces, sent straight to every Conclave channel. This wasn't propaganda, it was the raw, unvarnished truth. We'd broadcast their names, show their scars, play the lullabies they hummed into dying radios. The goal was crude and incredibly risky, to force the Conclave's cold, deliberative calculus to include faces they could not unsee. Leon shook his head. Faking their signatures was one thing, but inviting their direct, unblinking gaze was another. They will call this a ploy, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They will punish us for it. I met his gaze. And if we do nothing, Leon, they will have the bodies of children on their hands, and our silence to go with it. For a short while, the lie held. The forged signatures pulsed across the frequencies like a sacred hymn. Alien scanners read our cargo manifests and accepted them as legitimate. The human convoys, carrying their fragile cargo, moved forward. One by one, patched-up transports and old kindred ferries slipped into the corridor. Their holds were full of people and 1,000 small, private treasures, a set of carved dice, a battered doll, a hand-stitched map of a home that no longer existed. Just as the last convoy began its slow slide into the safety of the corridor, they appeared. The Conclave's main body materialized on our long-range sensors. They were vast, solemn, and arrogant in their silence. The galaxy's arbiters didn't rush. They pronounced. Their arrival was like a tribunal taking its seat. Across the enemy fleets, alien commanders stiffened. The Conclave hailed the system. A voice that sounded older than language itself asked for identification and manifest verification. Leon's forged chorus of data faltered, like an actor stumbling over a line. The Conclave requested visual confirmation. This was the moment. Open all channels, I ordered. No encryption. No edits. Let them see. The Soteria's feed became a blunt instrument. It was raw, human, and immediate. Streams poured out into the void. A child counting stars from a creaking bunk. A woman singing a sad old lullaby into a microphone. A medic, his voice strained, reciting the names of the wounded as he worked over a burn victim. There was nothing polished about it. Out in his ship, smelling of cordite and oil, Jace leaned into his camera. He read a little boy's name aloud, the syllables small and trembling in the radio static. The broadcast filled channels across light years. It was an intimate, insistent chorus that forced the Conclave scanners to pick out faces. Where they expected to see data, The Conclave's first reaction wasn't fury, but procedural shock. Their code, while rigid, had a clause about recognizing non-combatant status when clear evidence was presented. The sight of these lives, these faces, forced a bureaucratic pause. Their arbiters were recalculating. It bought us seconds, seconds that spread like thin, bright light. But seconds were not enough. They requested additional verification. Biometric scans, genealogical cross-references, legal attestations. The Calanth fleet demanded an on-site arbiter. The TERS commanders called us tricksters, declaring they wouldn't be hoodwinked by a human ploy. The standoff sharpened again, the tension ratcheting up. The corridor was narrow. It could only swallow ships so fast. The clock was still humming, counting down to the Conclave's final judgment. But something else was moving beneath the surface. Politics. Within the alien fleets, opinions were splitting. Some Calanth officers felt a cold shame at the sight of the refugee faces and began pushing for compliance. Some TERS commanders, on the other hand, feared setting a precedent that would let their enemies use civilians as shields. Our raw broadcast had shattered their certainty into 1,000 pieces. I saw a new chance and decided to risk even more. I ordered a limited strike, not an attack on the Conclave. Never that, but a move to force their attention even closer. We would put a human body directly in their line of sight. The act had one goal, to make the Conclave face not a number, but a person in peril. Ren volunteered. His fighter was scarred and small, but his hands were steady. He flew a low, dramatic arc that passed directly within visual range of the Conclave's distant optics. For a single, frozen heartbeat, the tribunal saw him. Not a blip on a screen, but a human face lit by cockpit lamps, gaunt and resolute. The sight was a knife. The Conclave paused again. This time, it was longer. Their legalists argued. Their executors hesitated. Our fate was balancing on a brittle hinge. The corridor still had ships inside it. The refugees were still counting on a miracle that we were now paying for with our courage and our lives. The gamble had only widened. If the Conclave accepted this emotional proof, the refugees might just make it. If they didn't, the label of combatant would fall on the Soteria and every human ship left in this system. 5 hours, the private chat repeated. A relentless heartbeat. Our convoys inched forward, their little lives threaded through a web of deception and theater. Risk was etched into my crew's faces. Every second was a calculation, every breath was a promise. The Soteria and its ragged fleet had chosen to bet a small slice of humanity against an ancient, unfeeling law. The Conclave would soon give its verdict, and with it, they would decide the shape of the war to come. The Conclave's silence was a weight that hung in the bridge air like thick fog. Sensors hummed, channels filled with procedural requests and the cold rustle of legalese. The human convoy crawled through the corridor as if through a throat. Each meter gained felt like a small miracle, but miracles had costs, and the Soteria's crew knew their bill was due. Mira watched the convoy's progress on 3 separate displays. The last transport, an ancient liner called Hearthsong, had a failing drive. Its jump coils glowed unevenly, and every engineer who touched them spoke in soft, worried words. If Hearthsong could not make the corridor, hundreds would be trapped. The relay's live feed kept returning to a child with a fever, his forehead damp under a thin blanket. The child's mother hummed songs to keep him asleep. They could not lose them now. Leon hunched over the relay core, fingers moving in staccato bursts. The forged Conclave signatures had held for the corridor's first stretch, but the Conclave's insistence for more proof grew louder. They wanted definitive visual confirmation in orbit. They wanted an on-site arbiter. Time peeled away like paint. The Soteria could not fake every demand. "We need a demonstration they cannot ignore," Leon said. His voice had a tired edge. Something raw, something human. Mira's jaw tightened. "Make sure it is real. Nothing staged." There was no time for subtlety. The plan they chose was blunt and dangerous. The Soteria would become a beacon not of stealth or strategy, but of exposure. They would break their own shields, broadcast continuous unfiltered streams of refugee life to every Conclave feed, and make sure the Conclave could not claim the images were forged. The risk was obvious. With shields down, they could be seen as vulnerable, an open target. But the hope was greater. The Conclave's law valued non-combatant protection when the evidence was undeniable. The human fleet moved like a single animal toward that decision. Jace and Ren took flight to bait distant guns. Engineers rerouted auxiliary power to camera arrays and long-range transmitters. The Soteria's shields dimmed as if holding their breath. For a moment the bridge felt naked. The broadcast began. It spilled raw, a grandmother telling an old story about seabirds on a broken world. A medic brushing dirt from a child's hair. A boy counting the number of stars he could see through a crack in the hull. There was no narration, no slogan, just life, steady and stubborn. The images cut through the procedural haze of the Conclave's feeds like a hot blade. But the Conclave did not bend instantly. Its first response was legal scrutiny, more scans, biometric checks, requests for lineage data. Protocols called for proof they must verify. The human feeds answered with names spoken aloud, wounds shown without gloss, ragged documents held up to cameras. The Soteria's crew recited family stories into the open channels. Long personal histories that could not be manufactured by a manufacturing AI. Faces, voices, accents, tiny, human markers that crawled into the Conclave's debate like seeds. Then Ren made his move. His fighter was light, scarred along the nose, a quiet thing that had seen too much. He pushed her hard, diving a dangerous parabola that took him into the Conclave's distant optics. For a heartbeat his cockpit filled their scanners. One human face, lit by low instrument light, eyes steady despite fear. Ren did not perform theatrics, he simply flew and became human in their sight. The Conclave's observers adjusted their focus from data to a person's breath. Across feeds, Jace read the names of those on Hearthsong. Voice unsteady but clear. The child with fever's name Tomas echoed across channels. Medics on the Soteria spoke of dosages and hope. The images were small and impossible to reduce to numbers alone. Somewhere inside the Conclave, a legalist's voice cracked an admission that the footage created a binding ethical obligation. The Conclave's doctrine included clauses for preventing mass harm to civilians, but these clauses had always been sterile words applied in far halls, not the sight of a child's trembling hand. The tribunal's balance tilted, slightly, toward mercy. Yet mercy did not mean acquiescence. The Conclave demanded assurances. The refugees must not be used as shields in the future. The humans must accept a monitoring token and enforcement mark that would make them traceable by Conclave ships if they broke the accord. The alien commanders exchanged terse messages. The Galactic wanted reparations in fuel and parts. The Terse demanded a guarantee that the gate would be neutralized after the convoy a safe passage to prevent being used again. Mira understood the cost. Accepting meant binding humanity to a watchful eye and risking the wrath of factions who would call it humiliation. Refusing meant burning innocent lives for pride. She chose to take a scar rather than a grave. We accept their token, she said. Her voice was low and steady. But they will not seize the refugees. We move. Now, the Conclave issued the token. A pale sigil that nested into the Soteria's calms. A tracer and a promise both. Its presence would record any future breach of the accord and call Conclave fleets down without question. The alien commanders watched the token embed like overseers, reluctant and yet compelled. With that, the corridor opened like a mouth. Hearthsong shuddered, coughed life into its coils, and answered the jump command. One by one, the transports surged forward and slipped into the corridor's throat. Engines glowed, drives screamed, and in the span of minutes, the convoy cleared the system. The Conclave watched everything. They had the photographs, the names, the live feeds. They had also the token that would make every human move traceable. When the last transport blinked out of system space, the battlefield exhaled, guns lowered, beams stilled, and the alien fleets sheathed their volleys like sheathing knives. The refugees were gone. The lives aboard Hearthsong and Kindred were preserved by a messy combination of bravery, improvisation, and costly compromise. The Soteria's bridge was quiet for a long moment. Some crew wept, others stared at the ceiling as if seeing stars there. Leon removed his gloves and watched the token's small sigil pulse in the comms. It felt like a brand, a bond, and a burden. News channels across human systems erupted in praise and outrage. Some called Mira a savior. Others damned her for inviting a watchful eye into humanity's future. The Conclave's token made allies and enemies in one stroke. But in one fact no one could argue. Hundreds of lives had been saved. Mira walked the Soteria's deck afterward, passing through pods that hummed with quiet recovery. She saw Tomas, forehead cooler now, sleeping with the stuffed toy clutched in his small fist. A nurse from Hearthsong smiled at Mira with tired gratitude. The commander felt the weight of what they had taken and what they had given. The Conclave's attention had been bought with truth and sacrifice. The cost would be the sharp knowledge that humanity was now a visible variable in galactic politics. As the Soteria made repairs and the crew tended to wounds, the fleets retreated to lick their wounds and calculate the new equations of power. The Galacters exchanged messages, their hatred softened by a grudging respect and a fear of a species willing to break rules for life. The Conclave watched with quiet satisfaction. Law had been upheld, lives had been spared, and a new precedent had been set. Mira recorded a short log in the aftermath, her voice small and raw. "We stepped in because we could not stand aside," she said. "We gambled with our name and took a mark we did not want. But tonight, names were saved. That will have a price. We will pay it, because we must." Beyond the Soteria, the galaxy shifted. The Conclave's token pulsed in calms across systems, like a new star, an unblinking presence that would mark humanity as both protector and pariah. The refugees slept in moving silence, their breaths of fragile music. Humanity had stepped in, and the echo of that choice would ripple longer than any corridor they had crossed. The repairs took days measured in endless, tired hours. The Soteria's hull was dented and coated with the soot of 1,000 micro-impacts. Fighters were scavenged for parts, while the med bay smelled of antiseptic and a fragile hope. The crew moved through routines that had become rituals: check shields, stitch wounds, read manifests, and sleep in shifts so someone was always watching the stars. Outside, space kept its indifferent rhythm. Inside, small lives were recovering. The news of the rescue spread fast and sharp. Human systems broadcast the relay feeds until every port and city knew the faces of those saved. The reactions were divided. Some hailed Mira and her crew as saints, heroes who had stood up when no one else would. But others called them reckless warmongers who had just painted a massive target on humanity's back. Handing our fate over to the Conclave's ledger. In the halls of power, political councils debated sanctions and medals in the same breath. That enforcement token from the Conclave, that thin, pale, humming signal, had baptized humanity into a new kind of visibility. Our allies cheered, but our adversaries were busy counting the cost of our interference. Mira walked a quiet corridor on the Soteria, past faded murals showing old Earth horizons. She stopped at a viewport, watching the stars drift by like slow, patient witnesses. Just then, Tomas, the little boy, now recovered, ran past with a nurse close behind, his grin like a small sun. In that moment, Mira felt a profound relief mixed with a deep, raw fatigue. Saving those lives had left scars, both visible and invisible. The token pulsed in her pocket like a second heartbeat. The Conclave's verdict hadn't been punishment, but conditional mercy. They demanded a public acceptance of their enforcement mark, assurances that the refugees would not be used as weapons, and compliance with future oversight. In return, they promised no immediate reprisals and withdrew their fleets from the blockade. The Gallant and the Turs accepted the terms too, but grudgingly. The Turs, bitter but pragmatic, insisted the gate be scheduled for a controlled shutdown once the refugee convoys were all through. The Gallant, on the other hand, wanted compensation, access to our parts and fuel reserves, and it promised that the Soteria would report any future interference. These demands began to reshape old alliances. Some human stations feared becoming vassals under the Conclave's watchful eyes, while others welcomed the protection that visibility might bring. Trade councils started whispering about new tariffs tied to compliance tokens. And of course, smugglers began dreaming up ways to mask their ships' signatures. The galaxy was readjusting around a new fact. Humanity was no longer a shadow. There were quieter changes, too. Within the Calanthander's fleets, conversations shifted. Some officers who had watched the Kindred's broadcast felt a flicker of something like shame. Others saw opportunity. A species willing to interfere for civilians could be a new, unpredictable lever in future disputes. And the Conclave? They took note. A small council was formed just to watch humanity, to map our tactics, and to file our actions into their ancient precedent books. We were now an entry in the galaxy's ledger, a variable that might just tilt the balance in tiny, unpredictable ways. Back on the Soteria, life was slowly rebuilding itself. The crew repaired what they could and sent messages to families across the systems. Leon, the comms officer, stayed up nights cataloging the forged codes he had used and studying the Conclave token that had replaced them. He felt a mix of pride and a light, nagging dread. An entry in the Conclave's files could last for centuries. That token was a record, and records always breed attention. Mira found herself facing questions from everyone: diplomats, grieving families, reporters. Some asked why she had risked so much for strangers. Others asked why she had accepted the Conclave's oversight. Her answers never satisfied everyone, because no single truth could. She said only what she felt. They had stepped in because there was no other humane choice. It was a simple sentence, but it did nothing to simplify the consequences. Weeks later, a quiet packet arrived for the Soteria, a sealed message from a Conclave arbiter. It thanked the human crew in formal terms no one expected, and it included something else: an invitation, an uneasy, official invitation to present testimony before the conclave on the topic of civilian protection. The wording was clinical, but the subtext was crystal clear. Humanity's act was now a case study. It would be remembered, argued over, and possibly used to create new galactic law. Some human governments cheered this as recognition. Others bristled, seeing it as a trap to bind us to ancient rules we never agreed to. This division rippled outwards. Underground networks spun up, hackers promising to hide ship signatures, merchants whispering of routes outside the conclave's site. The galaxy was splitting between those who wanted the conclave as moral high ground and those who saw it as just another leash. Meanwhile, the people who had been saved began to step into new lives. Hearthsong's passengers settled on a small human world that took them in. They started markets and clinics, telling stories of their glassed homeworld and the sudden light of rescue. Children played in parks beneath manufactured trees, their laughter like small, fragile declarations that, for them, the war was finally over. But not all endings were so gentle. The conclave's enforcement token made some doors slam shut. A few human stations lost trade partners who feared the token's trace. A handful of extremist groups took the token as a provocation, and a series of small sabotage attempts at fuel depots, at a communications outpost followed like dark echoes. The violence hadn't vanished. It had just reshaped itself. The real shift was subtler. A long game had begun the moment humans decided to act. Other species, watching how a small fleet had altered a stalemate, began to rethink how they fought their wars. The Calenthanters even tentatively opened back-channel talks about humane protocols, not because they'd grown kind, but because the presence of a third party now mattered. If any species could just appear and change the equation, then wars were no longer neat. Contain things. That uncertainty was changing everything. One evening, Mira sat with Leon and Ren in the mess hall, cups of bitter tea steaming between them. They compared their scars like medals and told quiet jokes, the habitual human way of keeping fear small. Ren's smile was thin. Jace, who had transferred to a quiet posting, sent a short message about fixing his fighter's nose. They laughed and then fell silent. Outside, the stars scrolled by, and somewhere, the conclave's watchful sigil pulsed like an unblinking eye. Was it worth it? Leon asked finally, breaking the silence. Mira looked out at the stars. We saved lives, she said. That answer will have consequences, and we will meet them. We are there now. The story closed not with triumph, but with a ledger entry and a promise. Humanity had stepped in and changed a war's outcome in 5 hours. The refugees lived. The conclave recorded. The galaxy recalculated. New treaties would be written. Old grudges would shift, and the Soteria would continue to sail a night sky now crowded with new expectations. In a small pod somewhere on the ship, Tomas slept with his toy tucked under his arm. He had no idea about tokens or treaties. He only knew warmth and the steady hum of the engine. And that, Mira thought, was enough reason to carry the burden of what they had done. The long game had begun, and humanity's name was now written, where everyone could see it, an unpredictable variable that would stir politics, ignite grudges, and perhaps in time teach a galaxy that sometimes life matters more than rules. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next one.